So now that we have our no image Minecraft character, Mr. Gerald here, how do we animate this? Well, we need to do two things. We need to rig the character, so that is create a skeletal structure that will deform or manipulate each of the meshes, and then we obviously need to animate it. So let's set up the rig. So ordinarily, when we're doing this, we need to use, or we would ordinarily use, an armature. That's this tiny little object. This is a bone, and it's also the armature. So as an object, it's an armature, and within the object is a bone. And normally, we would build a skeletal structure from this armature. But we don't need to do that because... let's just delete that, because the way that Blender works with objects, it provides a way that we can manipulate our objects in a particular way. And that is this little object that's at the center in this particular instance of these meshes, because of the way that we made them. That's this little dot. That's called the origin point, and this is basically a pivot around which our objects can rotate. So if we select the rotate tool, we can rotate our object, and we note that it's rotating around that origin. And this pivot can be used to control how our character articulates. So in this instance, what we want to do is two things. We want to change the position of this pivot relative to how we want the particular object to articulate. So for example, the arms, it rotates around the middle of the arm. What we want is for this to rotate around the shoulders. The same for the head. That rotates around the middle of the head, but we actually want it to rotate around the neck. So to do that, we have to reposition the pivot to where it needs to be. So let's just reset these objects. View, sidebar, clear the rotation. Reset, 0, 0, 0. Close that. So the way that we do this, a simple way to do this, viewpoint front. So we want to be in orthographic view. Viewpoint front. Select our object, and then this instance, edit mode. Select all, and then what we can do is use the widgets. So in this case we want the translate or transform widget. Hold Control, snap to the grid, and just move that up relative to, release to let go, relative to the origin, which is now down here. Instead of being here, it's now down here. So if we switch back into object mode, the widget, that's the manipulation thing itself, that was at the center of mass of our object, but now it's down at the bottom here. So we just now need to reposition this, hold Control, snap to the grid. So that now means if we rotate this, the head rotates around the neck, which is what we want. Let's just undo that. View, undo. So we need to do the same for the arms, the torso, and the legs. Adjusting the pivot, so let's go back into viewpoint front. So what we want to do is basically move the pivot of the arms from here to approximately here, and the legs from here to here, and the torso from here down to here. So we'll select each in turn and just edit those. So legs, we are in front, so edit mode, select all, control snap. And we might note when we do this, because we duplicated the leg, so let's go just to set that into place. Because we duplicated the leg, the change that we have made to this mesh has also applied to this mesh, because the change propagates over whilst we're in edit mode. So if we switch back into object mode to reposition that, transform, click drag, hold control, snap to the grid, we'll see that the object doesn't move, the duplicate object. So we have to do that manually. So when we duplicate objects, any changes that we make in edit mode will propagate across, but any changes in object mode, they won't. So there is a certain degree of independence between the objects. So that will now mean, let's go into and just double check. So that means the leg rotates roughly around the hip. Undo. So do the same thing for the arms. So edit mode, select all, hold control, snap. So let's go with, we want it center of mass of the shoulders, although we could, so let's just move this into position. So we've got a choice here with the arms, so we could either make it rotate around that point, or edit mode, we can change the position again. We're holding control, so it rotates around this point. So it's either or. Let's leave it like that for this one. Undo. So move that closer. And again, because we made a change to the arm in edit mode, hold snap. So that means both arms rotate approximately where the shoulder is, as it would be connected to the torso, as opposed to middle of the arm. So that now means that's how that moves. Undo. So we've done that to the arms. And then finally the torso. Edit mode, view, viewpoint, front, select all, control upwards, object mode, move that down again, snap. So now that moves relative to the waist or the hips. So that's step one. We've reorganized the origin points so that they act as a pivot. What we need to do next is create a hierarchy, a link between each of the components, so that when we move the torso, everything else moves with it. So the torso becomes the master object of the character itself, but we will add another object down at the feet here that we actually want to be using as the control, the master control over the entire character. So that, for example, if we want it to walk, we don't move the torso, we move the control object that we'll place at the bottom here. So let's set up the hierarchy first. So this is in essence creating a skeletal structure without an armature. We're using the relationship between the objects to create a hierarchical skeleton that we can then use to animate and manipulate our objects. So head, we want that connected to the torso, and we're going to use parent to do that. So head, shift click torso, then from the object menu we want parent and then object in the flyout. It's a little tricky in this orientation because we're a restricted view, but so object, parent, object, And then we'll get a little pop-up at the bottom. We want to make sure that keep transform is active. So the type is set to object, keep transform. So that now means if we select and manipulate the torso, just the torso, the head moves with it. So now we've created a parent and child relationship between the two objects. So now the torso controls the head. So we just need to do that for all the other parts. So shift click the arm, other arm and the legs, and then the torso last, because that's the master object that everything is being linked to. And then object, parent, object, check our settings, and that's okay. Double check that this is completed. Select torso, and it has. So what this now means is that we have essentially used our objects in place of bones that we would ordinarily use if we were setting up an armature to control our character. So instead, we're using the mesh objects themselves. And then the final bit, which I mentioned earlier, is to add an empty. Add empty. Let's just go with cube. That will drop in this wireframe, and depending on where the 3D cursor is, our object may appear all over the screen. So the way that we can fix this is in the pop-up that appears, we have our location properties, and we can just click type 0, 0, 0. That'll reset it. If this does not appear, what we can do is go into the sidebar and use the same properties to reset our object. Let's just close that. So now we need to link the character to that control object. So shift click the torso, because that controls all our objects. Everything is linked to it. So now we need to link the torso to our master object. So shift click the empty. Same process again, object, parent, object, make sure keep transform is active. It is, so that's okay. So now if we select the empty and move that, it'll move our entire character. The basic reason for actually doing this is that we essentially want to make sure that each of our components only performs the actions that it is expected to do. So the arms will only rotate, the head only rotates, the leg only rotates, and the torso essentially just moves everything in the character relative to the character. And that means that the empty is the thing that does just one thing, which is it translates. So it moves character. So we don't use the torso to do that, we use another object. In this case, that's the empty. So now that we've got that, let's save this. This is our rigged character. So we haven't used an armature, we haven't used a skeleton. We've essentially created one from the objects by linking them all up to create a skeletal structure, a hierarchy of our objects that is then parented to our master object, our master control, that is the thing that we move when we need to move the avatar. So if we want to make it walk. So let's just save this file, save increment, and then we can animate. But before we do that, we just need to do a little bit of housekeeping. Just to double check, as we are already in object properties, just double check the names of our objects. Let's just call the node that we added master root double check the meshes. Legs are. L, R, head, torso. Let's just save over that. This isn't critical, it's optional. It just makes it easier to understand what we're doing with our objects when we start animating them. So to animate, we're going to change this area at the bottom. We're going to switch out of properties into the dope sheet. And then from the dope sheet to the action editor. This just gives us a timeline. Let's just click, drag, snap that to the end. This gives us a timeline into which we're able to save the positional, rotational data for each of the objects as a marker. We'll see this when we actually do it, as a marker in the timeline. And we can do that at various points or frames along the timeline by moving the timeline scrubber and positioning that at the key frame, or the frame that we want to mark our keys to, hence keyframe. So we just make sure that's at 1, so we can either click drag or just click and it will go to where we need it to be. So we'll start at frame 1, manipulate our object, so we're going to rotate that forward, and we'll do it with this one first, and then to mark the keyframe we want object, animation, insert keyframe. Shortcut key is I for indigo. That drops in all the markers, and that will tell us what it's doing. So it's saving location, rotation, and scale data. So each one of these markers corresponds to the X, Y, Z, the orientation of our selected object that we've just manipulated. So that's our first keyframe. Second keyframe, so let's do 30 frames. So we're going to insert the same frame because we want this to repeat, so we need to have the first and the last frame be exactly the same. So we're going to insert under the keyframe, so press the I key. Make sure the mouse is over the 3D view when we're doing this. And then move the scrubber to frame 15 and flip that to the opposite side. Insert keyframe. So what we've now got is an actual sequence, and this will cycle. So if let's just quickly go into, so we're going to change the view into properties. We want output, and here we want to set the frames. So frame range, we want to set this to 30. Click, type, enter. We can set the frame rate as well. 30. Go back to the dope sheet. And that's already on the action editor. So if we press the space bar, our character's arm animates. Press space bar to stop. So all we need to do is basically repeat that process for all the objects that are going to animate. So frame 1, move that, insert keyframe, frame 30, again because we need the front and the back to be the same, frame 15, insert. So if we press the spacebar now, this is what we have. Let's make them a little bit bigger. So for the legs, same thing again, make sure we're at frame 1. So that goes the opposite way to the arm on the same side. Insert keyframe, frame 30, insert keyframe, frame 15, Insert keyframe. Frame 1, opposite leg, insert keyframe, frame 30, insert keyframe, 15, reposition, insert keyframe. So if we press the spacebar now, we have a very, very simple walk animation. So it is important to note here that although this is a very simple way to create an animation using the objects themselves, what this does mean, the disadvantage, is that we are dealing with each object having its own animated sequence. So let's just drop in the ones for torso. Although torso isn't doing anything and we don't necessarily need to do anything with it, let's just drop that in there. And the same for the head. But that does mean that we are dealing with separate sequences. So even though they function together as a group, because of the relationship that we set up, where everything is joined to the torso, and then the torso is controlled by the master root, even though they function as a group, each animated sequence is associated with an individual object. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. There will be 7 sequences. So for the walk sequence, if we wanted him to move, depending on what we were doing, so frame 1, we can move that all the way to frame 30, move him off center, insert keyframe, get rid of these, so Alt click or Option click, delete X, delete keyframes. So what he'll do now is he'll move because the master root is moving. So let's just save this, save increment. So that is how we can make a very big simple animation using our objects. If we were to do this properly, we would use an armature, which is for another video. Let's reset him. Sidebar 0. Insert keyframe. So he just walks on the spot. So now that we've got this, what do we do if we want to create another animation? We don't need to override or overwrite the existing sequence that we've got. We can create a new one. So for that, we've got various options. So middle click, drag, header. We've got a number of options available here. So we've got a name. This is the name that's given by default to the root node in this particular instance. And then we've got these little icons that control whether we make the animation a single user. This keeps the data in the file. We've got a new sequence, and then we've got delete. So before we create the new sequence, we want to activate single user for each of the sequences. So select our objects in turn, make them all single user. Let's double check. So the shield is active for each of them. We'll just save this so we have a restore point. So save increment. Because what we're going to do is click on the folder icon and create a new sequence from the existing sequence. So this basically duplicates the data, and we'll use that as the basis to create our new sequence or our new animation. And this is where it gets complicated again, because this is a very simple way of animating a set of objects. It now starts to get tricky because we've got a lot more sequences that we have to manage every time we create a new sequence. So again, to do this properly, we would use an armature and set up a proper skeleton. But again, that's for another video. So click on the icon. It'll create a unique instance. We can rename this. So click type. Let's just call this wave.wave. Activate the shield, again make the single user so the data is kept in the file. Do that for all of them. .wave. Shield single user. Duplicate. .wave. Single user. Single user. So that's all this is doing, is duplicating the existing sequence, giving us a canvas that we can then edit. Wave. So if we look at the name associated with this sequence, each of our objects, so .wave, 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 .wave. So reset. View, sidebar. Let's reset. Reset. So because this is a mirrored object, we need to be aware of the fact that this will happen. The object will flip upside down. So we need to be aware of -180 or +180. Either or. Same with that one, so that will be 180. 0, 0. Zero, so those don't need changing. Right, so insert our keyframes. Insert, insert. So this is going to override or overwrite the existing keyframe data. So for frame 1, well, we've had the scrubber. It's maintained the original poses, but we've reset for the other ones. So let's do a simple wave. Let's make this go off kilter a little bit. Insert that keyframe. So that data is now trapped. Now here, this is where it gets tricky. This is one of the disadvantages of doing this, because ordinarily we could copy the pose. So we would do a Control-C, but in this instance, this will copy the object. So what we might have to do here is to manage the keyframe or the sequence data by removing the existing keyframes. So Option click or Alt click. Delete, so that's the X key, keyframes. Do the same for both of them. So that keeps that position. Mouse over the 3D view again, insert keyframe, Back to frame 15. Let's do it down here. So insert. So now we have him waving. It's a bit of a weird wave, but he's waving nonetheless. Reposition that a little bit. Insert keyframe. And again, we can change the position of objects relative to what they were positioned as by just making sure that we have the marker over the frame we want to change. And then reinserting the data. This is where the pivot point comes into play in terms of how easy it is to manipulate our objects around it to create the pose that we want. It's a bit of a subtle wave. But if we want to change one of the other ones, again, because of the way that we've set this up, we have to delete. So let's insert that keyframe. We have to delete the existing keyframe because otherwise we are copy pasting. And what we could alternatively do, select the keyframe, key, copy keyframe. So key, copy keyframe. Put the timeline marker where it needs to be, key, paste keyframe. So we've got a couple of alternative ways that we can edit, manipulate, adjust sequence. But that is now a secondary sequence where he's waving. So all we need to do now is clear out the other sequences. So Option click, Option Shift click, or Alt Shift click, delete keyframes. Frame 30, we just want him standing still. Option click, Shift Option click, or Alt click. Insert. Click, Shift click, X, delete. Insert. And now he's just standing there waving. So if we play spacebar, that's his very simple wave animation. So that's how we create additional sequences. So we are duplicating the original, giving it a unique name, editing the timeline to create a new animation. But again, because this is a simple way of setting up a character, it means that we have to manage however many sequences there are that correspond to our particular objects. But in the next video, we'll take a look at setting this up using an armature and bones, which in the end is trickier to set up but easier to maintain and manage, whereas this is easier to set up but trickier to maintain and manage. So it's the opposite. But that is our animated Minecraft character. So let's save increment, and we're done.